The Sister Mary Byles Peace and Justice Prize and Lecture honors the legacy of an esteemed professor of humanities and theology at Maryville University. The prize, which includes a monetary award, is made possible through a generous gift by Stephanie and Howard Stanley. Until her death, Stephanie Stanley served on the board of the Interfaith Partnership of Greater St. Louis, personally bringing people of different faiths together in dialogue. She hoped such dialogue might bring about greater understanding and peace among people of different backgrounds. Sister Mary Byles, a religious of the Sacred Heart, had similar hopes and worked tirelessly to bring people together. Throughout her long career at Maryville, she was known among religious leaders in St. Louis for her significant efforts to further ecumenical and interfaith relations. A career educator, Sister Mary Byles arrived at Maryville in 1972, following appointments at Sacred Heart schools in New York, Connecticut, and Puerto Rico. At Maryville, she participated in interfaith dialogues, helped plan a Christian-Jewish workshop in the city, and invited leaders of many religious faiths to lecture. She remained at Maryville until her retirement in 1988, teaching part-time until 1992. She died in 2005 at the age of 91. Drawing attention to the moral and ethical issues still existing in modern society, this prize and lecture honors the remarkable individuals whose lives and work focus on issues of peace and justice, and more broadly, diversity and inclusion. The honor furthers Maryville's mission to instill a sense of social consciousness in its graduates. Previous lectures have been given by Diane Ream, Morris Dees, the Honorable Frankie Muse Freeman, and Anti-Defamation League CEO Jonathan Greenblatt. As Maryville looks forward, the Sister Mary Byles Peace and Justice Prize and Lecture will continue to serve as inspiration to today's leaders and to the next generation of change agents working to positively shape our world's future.
Good afternoon. I am Margaret Onken, Vice President for Development and Alumni Relations here at Maryville, and I want to welcome everybody to campus this afternoon. Today it is my special privilege to welcome Ms. Kathleen Zellner, renowned civil rights attorney, to receive the Sister Mary Byles Peace and Justice Award. Last year, as the video noted, we presented the award to CEO and National President of the Anti-Defamation League, Jonathan Greenblatt. So, you may wonder why a prize honoring a Catholic sister and former faculty member here at Maryville is being given to recognize achievements in social justice. I'm new, so me too. As the video stated, Sister Mary Byles was a beloved Maryville professor. She served at an earlier time in our history from 1972 to 1990. She belonged to the Society of the Sacred Heart, whose members were the original founders of Maryville. Sister Byles was a pioneer in her own right, too, well known among religious leaders for her efforts to further ecumenical and interfaith dialogues. The Peace and Justice Prize that is named for her serves as a reminder of how a single person, one person, can champion issues of social justice and equity and achieve far-reaching results. It sets a standard not just for the Maryville students, but for all of us, a standard to embrace diversity and encourage dialogue, and to look out for one another. Kathleen Zellner is an incredible example of those principles in action. She has spent her professional career working on civil justice issues. The firm's website offers that she deals decisively and courageously with legal matters that profoundly affects the lives of people from all walks of life. USA Today said of her, quote, "Those who have worked with and against Zellner describe her as a formidable opponent who comes prepared and fights for justice in cases few lawyers would dare touch." It's an honor to have her here today. Before we hear from Ms. Zellner, I would like to introduce Karen Tabek, John E. Simon School of Business professor and forensic accounting and litigation expert, to share some words and present our speaker.
Thank you, Margaret. It's my honor to introduce civil rights attorney Ms. Kathleen Zellner. She will receive the Sister Mary Byles Peace and Justice Prize. Kathleen Zellner in many ways embodies the spirit of Sister Mary Byles, who was a pioneering advocate for social outreach, diversity, and inclusion. Likewise, Kathleen Zellner is a pioneer, advocating for those who have been marginalized by a system that has denied them their rights and freedoms. She has focused her career on righting the wrongs that have resulted from wrongful convictions, from false arrest and imprisonment, and from police misconduct, medical malpractice, and much more. Her efforts have resulted in more than $108 million in verdicts and settlements for her clients. She is the only attorney in the United States to win 5 multi-million-dollar verdicts in a period of less than 1 year. For many years, it has been my privilege to work with Ms. Zellner as she fights vigorously for her clients. You may recognize some of her high-profile cases. She has litigated cases that include the homicide conviction of Stephen Avery, that's part of a documentary series on Netflix, Making a Murder. Apparently that's one we need to add to our to-do list. And closer to St. Louis, in Columbia, Missouri, Ms. Zellner was instrumental in overturning the wrongful murder conviction of Ryan Ferguson. These are but a few examples of the many individuals and cases she has championed. Through her life's work, Kathleen Zellner exemplifies the core values we celebrate by commemorating Sister Mary Byles. It's my pleasure to welcome Kathleen Zellner to receive the 2018 Sister Mary Byles Peace and Justice Prize.
Good afternoon. Thank all of you for attending. When I found out I was receiving this award, I was very flattered and did some research on Sister Mary Byles and realized what an incredible person she was. I don't know how her life was commemorated, but it certainly affected my life in receiving this award. I also asked, what do you want me to talk about? And they said, talk about your career. And I thought, well, my grandmother used to say to us when we were growing up, if you've got time to talk about what you've done, you probably haven't done enough. So I do want to try to weave some of my cases into this presentation, which won't be terribly long, but I want to try to convey some information to you about what we now call wrongful convictions, something that was pretty much unheard of when I started out. We now have 2,270 exonerees in the United States and a total of 20,080 years of people who've served in our usually maximum security prisons that were completely innocent. We have spent $2.2 billion compensating those people, which you could never really do, and half of them have never received a dime. And so my interest in this area of law started as the result of being appointed on a death penalty case for a serial killer. And so I represented, didn't have much choice about it, an individual by the name of Larry Eiler in the early 90s. And so I had to prepare a post-conviction. I had started my own law firm. I was the in-house counsel for a large HMO, and I was doing medical malpractice. But my clerks thought it would be interesting to see if we could tackle the complexity of a post-conviction case in 1992 with someone that everyone believed was guilty. So we started out, and we made incredible discoveries. He'd only been convicted of one murder. And I realized as we were progressing that we were really good at what we were doing. And yet, I'm getting ready to overturn the one conviction for someone that I know has committed 21 murders. So the dilemma I was in was to try to figure out how I could turn it into something positive, something good. I was being contacted by a lot of the victims' families. What I figured out was that my client was probably infected with the HIV virus, and I decided to have medical testing done, and I confirmed that he had a full-blown case of AIDS. So I went to him, and of course I'd spent many hours with him, and I persuaded him to give me the 21 confessions to all the murders that he had committed in tremendous detail. And I ended up helping to close all of those cases with 3 jurisdictions and the FBI. There was a task force formed. There are actually 9 jurisdictions in 3 states, and we closed all of the murder cases. I decided at that point I would never represent someone again that I believe was guilty. I did not see myself as a criminal defense attorney. I thought that our skill level on the Eiler case indicated that we, as small a firm as we were, could investigate and uncover evidence that the police had not and the prosecutors had not. And my next case was the Joseph Burroughs case in '94. I was called by the same group that national funding that had given me the Eiler case, so I really didn't want to take the call. But they said to me, he's innocent. We're very sure he's innocent, and it's going to take a tremendous effort because he's facing the death penalty, and he had an execution date set within 120 days of when we took the case. I had developed a network across the country of experts at that point from the work I'd done in medical malpractice, both as a defense attorney and as a plaintiff's attorney. So I had a very strong network of experts, and as a law clerk, I had spent a lot of time on criminal cases. So we took Mr. Burroughs' case and we began an intensive effort to save his life and vacate his conviction. And because I had been with someone who was so profoundly guilty and evil, I became an expert in recognizing innocence. And I knew that Mr. Burroughs was innocent. And this was not a DNA case. It turned on the testimony of his co-defendant who had committed the murder. And it was a ballistics test in the case in the sense that I figured out in consulting with ballistic experts a woman had committed the murder. It was the murder of an 88-year-old farmer in downstate Illinois, and there'd been a struggle where shots had been fired into the ceiling. And I knew the gentleman who was killed was so frail there wouldn't have been a struggle with my client, who was 6'2" and weighed about 240 pounds. So I got ballistics experts, and of course this woman who had been the chief co-defendant against my client had taken a 12-year sentence. So my client got the death penalty. The second person that she framed got life in prison, and she was going to be out in about 12 months. So I decided to focus all of my efforts on getting her, since I'd become so skilled at getting confessions, getting her to confess to me that she had committed this murder, because I knew, because of double jeopardy, that she could not be prosecuted for it, but it would advance the case. It would result in saving Mr. Burroughs' life. So I visited her 50 times. And we got to know each other, and we talked about Mr. Burroughs' children and the fact that he was months away from being executed, and they were executing people in Illinois at that time. And she gradually came around to the position that she would testify at the evidentiary hearing, which was in Kankakee, Illinois. And the case had generated international press. We had people there from all over the world because there hadn't been that many death penalty cases that had been overturned. So when I put her on the stand, of course I had not a lot of confidence in what she would do because she was very sociopathic. So the first question I asked her was, who shot William Doolin? And she paused and she said, I shot William Doolin. And it was that example of just the narcissistic, sociopathic, but the words came out of her mouth and it saved Mr. Burroughs' life. And so she ended up being charged with perjury. She served 3 more years. She never did get the death penalty, but I walked out the front door with him. And they took his handcuffs off, his chains. We walked out the door. He was on the front page of the New York Times. And I thought to myself, this is what I want to do with the rest of my professional career. I have gotten big verdicts. I've won millions of dollars in verdicts. I know that I can convince a jury. I was very empathetic with my medical malpractice clients because they'd been severely injured. But nothing in my mind topped the experience of thinking that you'd save someone's life, or you'd at least made a major contribution to saving their life. So we had at that time innocence projects, and we still have them in the United States through different universities, but we were the only private firm that was taking wrongful conviction cases, or ones that we believed were wrongfully convicted. We were funding it, so we were providing all of the money for the experts, and we were getting them out. And we weren't doing it to bring civil rights cases at that point. We were just doing it because we really enjoyed the investigation. We really thought we were good at it, and that there wasn't anyone else that was providing the service that we provided. What's happened in the last 5 years is we've seen an explosion of these cases. It's estimated now, most of the exonerations come from murder and rape cases, and that 5% of the people convicted of murder or rape in this country are in fact innocent. So someone was saying, but aren't you still just talking about a small fraction of the total number of people convicted of felonies? Well, actually it's a significant number, and I heard a law professor say, let's just say, he said, let's look at the data from the airplanes that fly in and out of the Atlanta airport in a week, 18,000 flights in and out. If 5 of those flights crashed in that week, the airport would be shut down. There would be such concern about the fact that the system had so failed that there would be a complete investigation of why this had happened. So with the wrongful conviction cases, we're now up over 2,000 cases, and it is a fraction of the number of people that are incarcerated for life or a substantial sentence that are in fact actually innocent. The estimates run as high as 20,000. Now we have the largest number of people incarcerated in the world in the United States. There has been an effort now to figure out how do these cases go wrong, what happens in these cases to make someone end up wrongfully convicted. And there's been a lot of data generated. There's been a call for an effort to systematize throughout the country all of the data and to have law enforcement using the data. But I can tell you from my experiences that a lot of the things that have been identified, like misidentification of eyewitnesses, false confessions, incompetence of trial defense counsel, all of those play a role in what has happened. But the reason that we continue to have wrongful convictions is we have not held the people accountable who are responsible for these wrongful convictions. What we've done is we've provided them with immunity. So law enforcement officers, and I'm sure many of you saw the case last week of the policewoman in Dallas that went into the wrong apartment. She was intoxicated. She shot the individual in the apartment and killed him. And of course, they will claim that she has qualified immunity because she's a police officer. What's happened is the qualified immunity that we provide to police officers in shootings or in these wrongful conviction cases has really become absolute immunity. They have a complete shield because of the way our courts have been interpreting the case law. So what the courts have said is with the Civil Rights Act, the section 1983, and the Civil Rights Act goes back to 1871, but the provision of it where a private citizen can sue a municipal government and sue anyone acting under color of law, i.e. police officers, prosecutors. The interpretation of that statute has gradually evolved to the point where the courts are saying, unless you can show us an identical factual pattern, we are going to uphold qualified immunity for the state actor. So the state police officer will get qualified immunity. Even more disturbing is that prosecutors are given absolute immunity. So you may think, well, gee, I mean, most prosecutors, if you've ever met one, they seem like decent people. They went to law school. They seem to be fulfilling. The problem is, of the 2,000 plus wrongful convictions, 84% of them involve prosecutors concealing evidence, coercing witnesses, helping to get false confessions, and basically hiding. The biggest problem is hiding evidence. And so the Supreme Court has now, just in the last month, issued 2 opinions that indicate that there may be some consensus developing from the far right to the far left. So Justice Sotomayor authored an opinion recently about the fact that qualified immunity has turned into absolute immunity for police officers. And Clarence Thomas, at the opposite end of the spectrum, has agreed that the doctrine has been basically turned on its head because the courts are refusing to decide new precedent that could be used. And so the attorneys end up in a position where they cannot make the case to show there's been a clear constitutional violation because they can't show the same factual pattern. That's developed in the civil side. On the criminal side, more egregiously, the Anti-Terrorism Act, which was passed in 1996, has resulted in a similar outcome where it is not possible in federal court to appeal a wrongful conviction case unless, once again, you can show the identical factual pattern existed in your case, and that's how you get to raise the constitutional violation. So let me give you a real-life example of that. This year, those of you that are familiar with the Making a Murder series, there were 2 individuals in that convicted. One was a 16-year-old. Many people worldwide saw the video of his confession. There were multiple ethical violations about that. He knew nothing about the crime. He gave all of these answers that made no sense, and the police basically told him what to say, and they videotaped all of it. You would think that that case would be overturned on that constitutional violation, coercion of a confession. And it was. It was overturned at the federal district court level. Then it was overturned, it was affirmed at the Seventh Circuit level, and then it was totally shut down in an en banc hearing about 6 months ago by the entire court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said they would not take the case. So even though there was a global response to seeing this 16-year-old without a parent present, being misled and fed information, having his own attorney basically sell him out, trying to get him to plead guilty, even though everyone could see it, and even though there was some initial success with it, it was ultimately shut down because of this federal statute, the anti-terrorism statute, because the Seventh Circuit said, well, the last coerced confession we decided of a juvenile was 50 years ago. And he was held in a room for 3 days, and they beat him up, and there was physical coercion. This Brendan Dassey case only involves psychological manipulation. So you don't have any precedent, so there is no relief. So you have to serve the life sentence that you were given initially. So it's something you want to be aware of as an educated adult, that there are these concepts in the criminal law system that have come to the forefront in trying to stop this wave with the wrongful convictions of when somebody's found to be innocent, even with DNA, that they still attempt to shield the police officers who framed someone or the prosecutors who concealed evidence from any liability. And this has been going on forever. With the Joseph Burroughs case, one of the reasons it was overturned is when we got the prosecutor's file, lo and behold, there is an eyewitness statement that gave Mr. Burroughs an alibi, and that was never turned over to the defense. And the trial judge said to me, he said, I gave Mr. Burroughs the death penalty. He said, partly because I thought we'd get better attorneys in here to reinvestigate it, but I'm the one that's going to undo it. And he said, despite the fact that you got Ms. Potter to admit to the murder on the stand, I would have overturned it on the fact that the prosecutor concealed the alibi witness that would have prevented Mr. Burroughs from serving 6 years on death row. And so I began to experience what would happen with prosecutors in terms of withholding evidence. It is done routinely, it is a widespread practice, and they have absolute immunity for doing that. And it's astounding to me when I talk to people in the public that they just had no idea. I mean, can you imagine if you went to work every day and there is no accountability for what you do? And by that, I mean, you're not just insulated from negligence. Prosecutors are insulated from suborning perjury. They are insulated from any type of fraudulent conduct. So they are insulated from committing crimes. Who else gets to do that in our society? So despite the fact that we know because of DNA, so with DNA, we now know that 1/3 of the people who were exonerated by DNA, they falsely confessed. So when I talk to people and they cannot fathom that they would ever falsely confess, I always say to them, you've never been in that situation. You've never been put in a room. You've never been shown pictures of your murdered daughter. You've never been yelled at. You've never been deprived of sleep. You've never been threatened with the death penalty and told that you could walk out the door if you would just sign this confession. You have never lived that reality. We know for a fact that people falsely confess, and those people implicate other people in the confession that get drawn in. So one of the most egregious false confessions, I think, in the United States that became one of my cases is Ryan Ferguson's case. So Ryan Ferguson, with no prior criminal record in his first year of college, is dragged in and told that the police believe that he's committed this murder because he was in the vicinity of where the murder occurred. He was at a college bar. He was in the vicinity of where the murder occurred because an acquaintance of his that he gave a ride that night has said that they were involved in the murder. When I saw, before I became his attorney, I was at a national conference and I saw the confession tape of his co-defendant, and I could not believe that a prosecutor or the police or the judge with a straight face could possibly think that this was a valid confession. You know, when you take a statement, a confession, you want to hold back evidence that only the killer will know. So it's a hallmark of interrogation. You never provide that information to the suspect that you're interrogating. So the Erickson confession involved the police officer saying, well, what do you think the murder weapon was? And Erickson is clueless. He says, well, was it a shirt? The guy goes, no. Was it a bungee cord? No. Let me tell you what it was. This is the police officer. Let me tell you what it was. He was strangled with his own belt. Right there, if there were any national system of evaluating evidence in a false confession, that confession would have been thrown out. It was preposterous. It was filled with leading questions. It was an outrage, and it carried all the way through to Mr. Ferguson, Ryan Ferguson, being convicted and given a 40-year sentence. Unbelievable. And you know what? When we walked out the door with him, it cost $11 million for that mistake. All of the police officers had to admit liability. None of them have been put in jail. Most of them are still in their jobs. And private insurance and the municipality has paid some of that money. So the $2.2 billion that's been paid has primarily been private insurance and the municipalities. People who can remember products liability starting in the 1970s, the reason our cars aren't bursting into flames and we're not having the wheels fly off of them is because a group of plaintiffs' attorneys brought litigation for products liability against car manufacturers. And as soon as they could feel the pinch financially, all of that stopped. So we now have a system in the criminal side where we are insulating the wrongdoers from, there's only been one judge that's gone to jail, and he was the DA in Texas, and he was sentenced to jail for his involvement in a wrongful prosecution. But so far, no one else has. We are just starting to try police officers for murder when they shoot someone 16 times in the back as they're running away from them with no weapon. That's going on in Chicago right now. I mean, not under the wildest stretch of imagination could that police officer have been in fear of his life. But that's what's gone on, besides the fact that, yes, there have been improvements in forensic science, and there's been a lot of forensic science that's been refuted. Hair and fiber, some ballistics testing, shaken baby syndrome. We've been able to advance all of that those things are not reliable. What we haven't been able to do is shut down the initiation of wrongful prosecutions. And I'll just conclude before we start the question and answer part about a really, I thought, because I don't want you to think I'm really cynical about the system, because I've been in it long enough that I believe these things can all be changed. But I had a situation this year where a client of mine was charged with murder in Arkansas, which is extremely conservative. It was in Little Rock. And it was the death of an individual who'd gotten in a hot tub, who was intoxicated, had drugs in their system. And of course, the hot tub temperatures were well over 100 degrees, and he died. And there was no other indication of foul play. My client, a college graduate, a Walmart executive with children, had sponsored this party at his house, so seemed like a pretty good target for the cops. So next thing he knew, he was arrested. And the case got international publicity. It was called the Amazon Echo case, because he and these guys had been watching a football game, and the prosecutors decided that Alexa might have recorded the murder. So they were just hot to go for that. They wanted that recording. So we decided in the office, under our litmus test of wanting to represent innocent people, that when the young man came to our office, if he volunteered to play the recording on Alexa for us, that would be a big step towards knowing that he was innocent. So when he came in, one of the first things he said to me, "Do you want to hear the recording?" And I was like, yes. And so we played the recording, and it consisted, now this was a worldwide event. Amazon had moved to quash the subpoena. They didn't want anyone to think that Alexa was recording without actually signaling it, that it was randomly recording. So we played the recording, and one guy says, "I think he should have done a quarterback sneak." And the other one says, "Oh no, I think that passed. That worked out really well." And then it ended. And I thought, wow, hardly evidence of a murder. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call the prosecutor. I'm going to fly down there. I'm going to take the recording. And I'd already talked to blood spatter experts and DNA experts and a forensic pathologist. And I knew this was not a murder. So I flew to Little Rock. I said, "Here, nobody needs to do a subpoena for this. We're just going to turn it over. There's nothing on here." So I knew that was a step towards establishing my credibility with him. I said, "Why don't you fly back to my office in about a month, and I will fly my experts in, and let's sit down, and you bring everything you've got from your expert. I think I can convince you no murder occurred here." And he said, "Okay, I'll do it, because I don't want to be responsible for convicting someone who's innocent." And I thought, I haven't heard that from a prosecutor ever. So that's what we did. So he flew to my office, I brought in these two experts, and we spent 8 hours, and we went through all of the evidence. And he said, and he had tremendous pressure from the police department, tremendous. And of course, he's a politician. He's been elected to office. The police helped elect him. So he waited about 2 months, and the case was moving towards trial. And so we just started getting ready for the trial. I thought, well, it was nice that he came here, but it had no effect on him. And then he called me, and it was a week before I was supposed to appear for some preliminary matters with the judge. And he said, "I'm dropping the charges. We're not going forward. I am not going to be responsible on this evidence for convicting someone who's innocent." Now, the reason that was so significant, you might think, well, gee, you're saying that you had the evidence, you would have won. No, I would not have won. I'll tell you why. One of my experts had done 2 murder trials in Arkansas. He said, if you're charged with it, you will be convicted of it. It does not matter what you come in with, they stand with the police. So if you get this in front of a jury, he's going to be convicted. And I thought that was probably reality talking, that he would have been convicted. So because this young prosecutor had a conscience and was unwilling to proceed for his own aggrandizement, because usually wrongful convictions happen around the time of elections, it saved this young man's life. He's now working, he's going to go to law school, and it's the most important thing that will ever happen to him in his life, that he did not have to go through what I've got Ryan Ferguson with me today, and I've got Mario Cusciaro. Mario is just, I guess, in his last semester, getting ready to graduate from law school. And so I'd like you to also hear from them. So I guess the message I'm sending you is you want to be educated about these issues with prosecutors and the police and judges, because they're running, particularly the prosecutors and judges, they're running for election. You want to know about their records on this issue. Because when you wrongfully convict someone, and I had really a mixed feeling this week about one of my cases. I represented a man named Jerry Hobbs, and Jerry Hobbs was arrested and held for 5 years without a trial for the murder of his 9-year-old daughter and her 7-year-old friend. It was clear the case was a sexual assault. The prosecutors blocked, and I wasn't involved in getting the exoneration, they blocked the Innocence Project from getting the DNA done for 5 years. He sat in prison. When the DNA was done, it exonerated Jerry Hobbs, and it identified Jorge Torres. Mr. Torres, after the murder of a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old, was in the Marines. He moved to Virginia. He raped 3 women, and he murdered a fellow female Marine officer. All the while, the prosecutor in Lake County, Illinois, fought the DNA testing done that linked him to those murders. That should be viewed as a crime, and that should be something that a prosecutor is sent to prison for. That cost someone their life. It cost 3 women were raped. One was an attempt murder. And it was all done because of the arrogance of that office in locking in on the father. And of course they tricked him. He signed something saying that he'd done it. They weren't misled, they wrote it. And that's the sad reality. And that happened just this week, that we learned that Torres had appeared in Illinois. Finally, the murders were in 2005. 13 years later, he pled guilty and he was given a 100-year sentence. He was given the death penalty in Virginia. So that's the other component of wrongful convictions. When you have the wrong person locked up, the real killer is still out there, and they're still out there attacking people and murdering people. And that should be criminal to let someone like that go. So what I'd like to do is maybe start with some questions from the audience, and then I want to get Mario and Ryan to come up. So throw anything out. There are no stupid questions. Just give me a...
Hey, I'm here. My name's Dr. Murray, Jermaine Murray from Maryville, and I'm here to give the microphone to anyone who wants to ask a question. I already see one.
Thank you very much. I'm curious how much you feel that the behavior of judges and prosecutors is affected by a bias, particularly racial bias, and how much that plays into behavior.
Right. I think the statistics on convictions, wrongful convictions for black people, is 20% above Caucasians. So there's definitely a bias built into the system. And the black clients that we've had, it is appalling. I've got someone now that every witness who took the stand said he was not the shooter and he wasn't present, and that he was 6 inches shorter than the shooter, and he was convicted. It's just, they just look at it, it's like you're sitting there particularly if you're black, and they're not going to pay, particularly pre-DNA, any attention. So there's tremendous bias. But I'm also here with two of my clients. Now half of my clients are Caucasian males that had no criminal record.
What could we do by way of educating people within the judicial system away from their bias more formally? During law school, could we require some sort of intentional learning?
There's been a call for, just like we had with the National Institute of Health, standardizing different ways that evidence is evaluated, and that we'd have some national oversight committee and data bank that would be, and there's attempts going on now to do that, to force some recognition where a judge can't just be a rogue judge out there. North Carolina has formed their own Innocence Commission, independent of the judiciary entirely. It's a commission made up of, you know, I would say most of the people are well educated, but they come from all walks of life. They reviewed 1,500 wrongful convictions last year. They have to review it and make a determination whether the court then should review it, and they picked up just slightly under 10% of those cases of the people being wrongfully convicted, which is significant, and a group of lay people did that. This week in Golf Digest, there's an amazing story about a man named Valentino Dixon. He got a 27-year sentence for first-degree murder, and he loved to draw pictures of golf courses from prison. So he started drawing, and he loved the 12th hole at Augusta. So he started, and they're beautiful drawings, sending them to Golf Digest. He sent 100 drawings. And then they got curious about him. They wanted to know about his case. Well, his case was a microcosm for wrongful convictions. He had counsel who never put a single witness on. There was no forensic evidence linking him to the crime. The prosecutor had concealed evidence, it appeared. Witnesses had been charged with perjury if they were going to testify that he was innocent. Golf Digest ended up being responsible by getting attorneys for the exoneration. So, I mean, that's amazing that that happened. There's no question, too, that there's a correlation between high publicity and people, and that's the Making a Murder is a perfect example of that. That case would have just been forgotten if those two film producers hadn't spent 10 years on the first series, and the second series will be equally involved. So it's a massive re-education program, but we need to have national standards for evidence, you know, where all confessions are videotaped continuously, where eyewitness testimony has been pretty much debunked. We don't, informants, to make it almost impossible for an informant to testify against somebody. So we've closed in on some of those areas, but there's no question most judges, I mean, they probably took high school biology, and when you try to present something to them of any complexity, it's just, they don't get it. I mean, in the Avery case, the lunatic EDTA test that the FBI did would never have gotten past Daubert, the Daubert standard, but they didn't recognize Daubert at that time in Wisconsin. So it's nationally exposing the cases, it's setting up and trying to compile the research and the data and all of that, but more than anything, it's holding people accountable. It's holding them accountable.
So I'm sitting here hoping that there will always be in the future people who are doing you and the law firm that you have, that you're doing this kind of work. Do you see young lawyers interested in this kind of work?
Yes, very. We get resumes from all over the country, people wanting, young students wanting to come in and just work for free to be there. And they've been remarkable. You'll see, if you watch Making a Murder 2, which is coming out in a few weeks, you will see some of my students, they're with me. And so they have finished college, or they're in their last year of college. They are thinking about going to law school, and I really like having them there. I say I have my own in-house jury. I don't want to just talk to other attorneys, they're brainwashed. I want to talk to young people that are creative, that come up with ideas about evidence, that a lot of them have very strong science and technology backgrounds. So yes, I think that there is. And the more documentaries that are done, the more we can educate, I think, because young people are, you know, on Netflix, I mean, they're spending $80 billion developing documentaries in the next couple of years.
It's encouraging.
Yeah, I think it's very encouraging.
John Lewington, how do you deal with he said, she said cases? Because we have Anita Hill, Dr. Ford, we have the Bill Cosby trials. We could go on and on about the list. Our own Governor Greitens involved in those kinds of things. How do you deal with that?
I'm always very suspicious of the he said, she said. I've recently represented and am representing some of Larry Nassar's victims, the doctor. And those are very real cases without physical evidence. Many of the girls were minors, but if you do enough sexual assault cases, there is a certain criteria that you approach them with. I don't like the fact, you know, that there isn't physical evidence, but many times there's not. But typically, I just had a case in Colorado where a young woman was molested over a period of 3 or 4 years by a wealthy businessman, and he pled guilty last week. We had the sentencing hearing, and again, there wasn't physical evidence, but he ended up pleading guilty, and there was the detail. What's troubling to me about the he said, she said, most sexual offenders are repeat offenders, so you're not going to have one incident. So I'm always suspicious when there's reporting of just one incident. And we can't be presuming people guilty until we prove them guilty. You're supposed to have a presumption of innocence. We're in a troubling time, I think, because there are legitimate sexual assault cases, and there are definitely cases that are being fabricated. And a law school professor said once, and I thought it was really true, he said, if you accept that there are people evil enough to rape women, you must also accept, to be logical, that there are people evil enough to make up rape allegations. And so I think that you can't, you know, we had the nursing school cases out in California, the witch hunt of those cases, the Devereaux case, 29,000 counts of sexual molestation with hundreds of individuals. All of those were thrown out. Those were all fabricated. I represented a police officer whose wife fabricated that he'd molested his children by his first marriage. He spent 20 years in prison until the children reached adulthood and came forward and testified at the civil trial. I didn't get him exonerated, but I represented him in the civil trial, that it was all a lie. And the biggest lie in the case was that his wife, who had framed him, had an ulterior motive because she was having an affair with the lead detective. And that happened right here in Missouri and Kansas City, the McKinley versus White case. That wealthy businessman's wife was involved with the lead detective, and they framed him, and he spent 5 years in prison. So I think you have to be extremely careful with those cases, because people just jump on a bandwagon, you know, and it's dangerous. And you get people who are falsely accused and convicted. So I want evidence. I want evidence. I don't want a he said, she said.
I want to shift gears just a little bit. You mentioned, we talked a lot about prosecutorial misconduct, and we've talked about judicial bias, but one of the things that you consistently mentioned is incompetent representation at trial. Yes. Where do lawyers go wrong? At the trial level?
I know exactly where they go wrong, okay? Let me tell you. This is what criminal defense attorneys do, and that's one of the reasons you want to watch the second series of Making a Murder. What they do is they don't hire experts. Now, in Making a Murder, the state had 14 experts. The defense had $350,000, and they hired one expert who was a forensic anthropologist, and he looked at photographs and never even examined the bones. What they do is they pocket the money. And so what we do now on post-conviction is we raise that, and we've been very successful at doing it. If you don't have an expert, a forensic pathologist, like the case I talked about in Arkansas, if you have not brought in a DNA expert, a blood spatter expert, a ballistics expert, if that's part of the evidence, then we raise your ineffectiveness. It is a constitutional violation, and the courts are responsive to that. And you're going to see, you know, when I watched the first series of Making a Murder, I saw, and I'll tell you why I took the case. He had written to us, and we had looked at it just from what the courts had filed, and I saw there was all this forensic evidence against him. His blood was in the car. His DNA was on her car key in his bedroom. Her bones were in his burn pit. The bullet in his garage had her DNA on it. It's like, whoa, this is, I mean, we were like, no way, we don't want to take this case. Then I watched the documentary and I thought, oh, wait a minute. This forensic stuff is bogus. I can tell by watching it how unbelievably superficial it is. No photographs are even taken when they find the bones. They keep the county pathologist from coming on the property. So I thought, I'm going to take it and I'm going to hire world-renowned experts. I'm going to do ballistics, blood, and if I dump a ton of money in it, I'm going to do it because I think this guy's innocent. I'm even going to do brain fingerprinting that the CIA does on him. That's where I started, and he passed that. So guess what we found? Okay, this is fascinating. So with the blood in the car, one of the leading blood spatter experts in the world said, oh, it's obvious. Somebody stood at the driver's door and they dripped in 6 little drops of blood. He said, what we did was we tried to duplicate what happened with blood on someone's hand dripping, because supposedly his finger was cut. And amazingly, the blood ended up in 12 more places in the car. It was on the door handle, the gear shift, the brake. It was on the hood release, all of those things. We thought, wow. He said that blood is planted. So I thought, okay, what about those bones in the burn pit? So I hired John DeHaan, probably the leading fire forensic expert in the world, and he said, there wasn't a body burned in that burn pit. He said, there's absolutely no evidence. And he's actually burned human bodies more than anyone in the world, which is a weird occupation. But this is the guy that knows. And he said, there was no body burned there. He said, a barrel was used and 40% of the bones were tipped into the burn pit. So someone poured bones into the burn pit. He said the teeth are missing. He said the teeth never melt. And he said if you had burned at a crematorium level of heat at this burn pit outdoors, you would have burned down the garage and blown up the propane tank. He said you could not sustain the temperature degree for the bones. I thought, whoa, that is wild. He said it's totally fabricated, no body burned in there. So I thought, okay, we knocked that one out. Then I went to the hood latch. I said, well, my client's DNA is on the hood latch. So I got DNA scientists, and they did the experiments, and we took people and they opened the hood latch over and over and over again. Guess what we found out? We found out that the amount of DNA on the hood latch is 90, the times quantity that would have been left if a person had just opened the hood latch. So then we started tracking where is the swab that was taken from Mr. Avery and substituted in as the hood latch swab, and we found it. They took 2 groin swabs from him when they'd arrested him for a gun charge. So we're like, what are you doing groin swabs when somebody's arrested for a gun charge? They pocketed the 2 groin swabs. because we knew it was going to be epithelial DNA, and then they turned those to the crime lab. So that was the hoodlash. But here's the one I love, and it's terrible. The state's theory was she was shot twice in the head, and the state's theory was that the .22, which is very soft lead, was lying right there in Avery's garage. They missed it the first 6 times. They were in the garage, couldn't find it, couldn't find it, couldn't find it. Then they found it, and they said, whoa, it's got her DNA on it. So I asked them, can I have the projectile? I want to take it to my lab. So I took it to Microtrace, which solved the Unabomber case, numerous airline crashes. It's probably the best forensic trace lab in the world. And they looked at her under a microscope, a very advanced, sophisticated microscope, and they said, well, that bullet's got red paint on it and wood. So wait a minute, so where's the bone? If you shoot a .22 through someone's head, I don't care how many times you shoot it, the lead's so soft, it's like a sponge, it's gonna have bone on it. So then I flew to Arizona, I hired Luke Haig, we shot out in the desert, .22s through bovine, bone, and every single one of them was embedded with bone. So what do we know? We know that .22 was stuck in the Avery wood in the garage, and they just pried that thing out of there. Again, we found her DNA, the trace back to what DNA of hers they used to put on there. Because it also had wax on it, and they just happened to have her chapstick. So it's just staying on it. That's what we did. We're going to be like a wrecking crew with this evidence, and we're going to expose what they thought was a dunk shot case. So that's how we did it with the... Okay, why don't you guys come up? Because like I said, if I keep going... Excuse me? Come on up. Give me a break. Okay, so I have Ryan Ferguson. Many of you might recognize him. And then, why don't you come out here? Mario Kashar, I'm in a lineup. They are innocent. Thank you. Yeah, I can sit on that one. So the profile on these two people is they come from very good families. Mario's family owns grocery stores in Lake County. He's just finished his he's getting ready to finish his last year of law school. He got caught up in a nightmare case that went on in Illinois, and finally the appellate court threw it out. And then many of you might recognize Ryan Ferguson. Neither of them had any criminal record, any indication they would ever be incarcerated. So I'll let you ask them questions.
Anybody got any questions?
Somebody must have questions. From who? Yeah.
Do you guys have mine?
That's what I'm saying.
Any questions?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think just to add on to what Kathleen said, it breaks down to a very simple thing, motive. So if somebody needs career advancement and you're a prosecutor, there's only one way to the top, convictions. That's the way that I put food on my table, that's the way I get a new car, that's the way I get a new house. So you're a prosecutor, and then the problem with the whole situation is there's no repercussions. So I'm doing whatever I can to convict somebody, but what if it's the wrong person? I don't care because it's not me, I'm moving on in my career. That's the problem that we have. And I think if you looked at any other profession, if an architect were to develop a property and it imploded, they would take away his license. There's safeguards in almost every other profession, but not for prosecutors.
Right, and I agree. The thing to me, and spending 10 years in prison, fighting the justice system, the criminal justice system, with my father and with Kathleen, and looking at how it actually operates, the thing we saw is that even though you can have terrible attorneys, trial attorneys, you can have bad evidence, whatever all these things might be, the number one issue, and I think Kathleen agrees, Mario would agree, most people in our situation would agree, the number one issue that would resolve everything is accountability. And you look at, if prosecutors have accountability, then 99% of these wrongful convictions go away immediately, because they're going to start actually presenting real evidence. They're not going to put on people they know have perjured testimony that are lying, and so on and so forth. And what I think is really interesting is a few years back, Kathleen and I were at a conference with federal judges, and Aaron Moriarty from 48 Hours was there, and the judge asked, like, what is the one thing that should happen? And I mentioned that prosecutors have to be held accountable, and until we do that, until the public stands up and says this has to happen because this is our legal system, right? Every single one of us, this is our legal system. I didn't think I could be impacted by it. I'm sure Mario didn't think he would be impacted by it. Nobody in our families have been impacted by it. We haven't done anything wrong. It could be our brothers, sisters, mothers, whoever it might be. And many of us now see that we know someone who's been impacted by it. But until we stand up and say it needs to change, it won't. And the judge is like, well, I don't think that a lot of prosecutors would want to prosecute cases if they thought they could get in trouble for wrongdoings. And Moriarty was like, no, I completely disagree. I think they have to be held accountable. And we're not saying that if, something that they didn't find, right, something didn't come up, that we're going to try to prosecute a prosecutor. We're saying if we know that they put on perjured testimony, if they know that they're fabricating evidence and you can prove these things, how is it that we're not prosecuting those people when we're proving that they are subverting justice, when we're proving that they have taken a human's life, and in some cases actually have taken a human's life by putting them on death row, and in other cases, like Kathleen mentioned, the fact that while you have an innocent person in prison, a guilty person is out there committing crimes. They are generally repeat offenders. They are doing something else to somebody else that could have been prevented. So it is up to us as a community to be aware of what's going on in our legal system and to make others aware of that and to ask for accountability as well. And I think through Kathleen's work, especially with the civil component, it's bringing about that awareness and it's bringing about that accountability.
I do think just in the last 6 months, 2 states have passed statutes making it a felony for prosecutors to commit Brady violations or to fabricate evidence. So one thing I didn't make clear when I was speaking is immunity, the immunity doctrines are judge-made doctrines. Those were not created by statute. Section 1983 does not talk about immunity. They never envisioned, I think, this development of providing immunity. Judges have provided that immunity to prosecutors and to the police. The state legislatures can pass, as New York has done, as California has done, legislation making it a felony for a prosecutor to be involved in framing someone by committing what we call a Brady violation, where you conceal evidence. And that, as I was telling you, I have seen in almost every single case I've had, the prosecutors holding back, partially disclosing evidence that should have been disclosed in the beginning. You can bet that if you became a prosecutor and your state had a statute that you're going to go to prison and that it's a felony if the case falls apart, you're going to make sure within your office that those attorneys are trained and people understand that, this isn't just a job to politically advance yourself, that there are real serious repercussions. So one way I would start is with legislators within the state of contacting them. Why don't you emulate New York, emulate what California's done? We want accountability, even petitions. I mean, social media is so powerful, and now there are states doing this, and I think you would see these wrongful convictions. I mean, what you want to do is put people like me out of business, okay? Not just let me keep going. Put me out of business. Do that. Yes?
This is a question for the two of
everything?
I would say attention to detail. Just like any other profession, the people that excel focus on details. I think that my prior trial attorney I thought was very good, but he was very much a generalist. He had a generally good idea about things. She uncovers every stone, and at some point you're going to find the littlest piece of evidence that ends up being a big piece of evidence that ends up being an overturned conviction, which ends up being a civil rights violation, and on to the next one.
I think attention to detail, this is probably saying the same thing, it's somewhat redundant, but it's preparation, which is attention to detail. And you see a lot of attorneys, especially trial attorneys, and they're semi-prepared. They have multiple cases. They take your retainer, $50,000, $100,000, whatever it might be. And for them, and I think my father pointed this out quite well, and saying that, how long does a trial last here in Missouri, for instance, right? Generally a week at most. And the reason is because most people, if you can afford a private attorney, you're going to pay $50,000 to $100,000. And for them, even though it's not written in stone by any means, that's going to give you a week of their time. And they need to go on to the next case, and so they're not preparing until a week or 2 weeks before trial, and they'll give you that week, and then they want to go home and get back to what they're doing and make more money. Whereas Kathleen, she knows that she has to do the job right, and she wants to get justice. So, and I don't know her financial situation, but I know it doesn't appear that that is an issue to her. It's like, it doesn't matter if it's going to take 2 weeks, 10 weeks, we're going to sit there and we're going to get this job done properly. And I think that's what you see differently between Kathleen and very successful attorneys who are actually doing good work compared to the majority of attorneys that are trial attorneys.
And I hate to monopolize, but one of the questions, the second question I was going to ask, and now since the two of you have addressed it, you know, for example, in our state, the public defender's office, the county PD actually sued because, and they did something even more creative than that, but there is a financial crunch. And the majority of attorneys are not operating with $50,000 budgets, and they're not operating where there are limitless expenses. I mean, most of as we know, you all are fortunate and a subset, and in some ways you are privileged even amongst offenders because there are, the majority of offenders are going to be very low income, cannot afford private counsel. So I guess the question is, how do you combat that resource gap? Is it by trying to pursue policies both at the state, local level, and with the bars that that promote more transparency and accountability? But it can't just be money, because we know it's not there for the vast majority of people. So what would you say to that?
There's no question the United States has got more people incarcerated than any country in the world. We are overcharging people. We have federal laws that are ridiculous. You can bring a certain type of fish back and have a felony. I mean, we have just gone crazy creating crimes and charging people with them. And but see, the reason, if you impose, even through state legislation, penalties for mischarging, okay, that you're gonna go to jail as the prosecutor, all of this stuff would stop. They've already started reforming the drug laws, okay, getting people out of jail, not requiring them to post bond, not putting them in jail. All those reforms can be done. You don't have to just work off the back of a wrongful conviction. You need to stop it before it starts, and those are the people creating these laws. I mean, a lot of it goes back to the state legislature, I think. We overcharge people. Mario Casciaro has got, you know, it probably should be in the Guinness Book of Records. They charged him with a crime that the appellate court said does not exist in Illinois and does not exist in the United States. Okay, so he's in a maximum security prison on a murder case, and there is no crime for what he was charged with. And I think recognizing that's huge. Here's the second way that he hit the Guinness Book of Records. There have only been 324 murder cases in the U.S. where there's been a prosecution, and there is no body, human body, that's ever found. So you never find the victim's body. The victim disappears. You charge someone with murder and prosecute them. Can you imagine the millions of murder convictions, and there's only 300 where you don't have the physical body of the victim? So do you think this was an overreach? You make up a crime, a predicate felony that doesn't exist in Illinois. We couldn't find it existed anywhere in the United States. And you never find the victim's body. He could be living in California. And you hold all your press conferences, make a big to-do, and you send someone off to prison. Now, don't you think those folks ought to be charged criminally and be in jail? And don't you think that would dampen the enthusiasm for creating all of these crimes and then all of these people having to come up with the money or go to the public defender's office? If you could cut the public defender caseload, by 80%, we'd be functioning at an efficient level. But this whole thing has gone on. It's called politicizing crime. And that's what's been done in the United States for the last 25 years. So people make careers. The tough on crime thing is totally, completely backfired. Totally. It's a joke.
That's an excellent segue to my question, which is, should prosecutors not be elected to office, but perhaps hired in some more conventional, non-political way?
I don't think that that's the problem. I think the public needs to be aware of their records, but whether they're elected or not, you need to establish accountability through the state statutes. Just like we create crimes, well, let's create a crime for prosecutors. That's what they've done in California. That's what they've done in New York. That's what's going to happen.
I think ultimately, if you look elsewhere in the world, there are systems where the prosecutor isn't always just a prosecutor. They are also sometimes a defense lawyer, so they're less motivated because their day-to-day grind isn't just being a prosecutor and my only way to advance is a conviction. They're just thrown into a case. They're not biased. They have no prejudice. They're coming in and just looking at the facts. One day they're a defense attorney, one day they're a prosecutor. That's the fairest way. We're not anywhere near there, but as far as from the justice systems that I've seen in the world that I've studied, I think that's what worked the best.
Okay, our crime rates have been dropping dramatically, so this hysteria over locking everyone up, it's based on ignorance. The murder rates in the U.S. have consistently been dropping. So.
Okay, we've got time for one more question, and then we'll adjourn and have a party.
Okay, my question is not as complex, but Mario, did you have plans to go to law school before you were wrongfully convicted, or did that push you in that direction?
Interesting question. Yes and no. So yes, I always saw myself possibly being an attorney, but I thought it would be more through the business world. And then once this happened to me, I kind of saw a whole different ray of light. And it has much more value than just making a corporation money. I personally believe the most valuable commodity in the world is freedom. So at this point, I see more potential in my life to help other people in the world by helping give people freedom than making money. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for all those fantastic questions. And now we're going to have a beautiful reception right outside of the auditorium, and everyone's invited. Thank you so much for coming, by the way.
Thank you.